The first thing Tommy Vega noticed wasn't the bike. It was the way the three men stood when the flatbed's diesel rattled down Route 49 and rolled to a stop outside his garage. Too still, too quiet, like they'd brought something heavier than metal. Tommy had seen every kind of customer in 40 years, seen panic, anger, embarrassment, the whole messy range of human need that drives people to drag dead machines to a man who still believes in second chances. These three didn't carry any of that. Leather vests worn soft by highway wind. Faces set in a way that said they weren't here to bargain or chat or hear excuses. They didn't shout over the truck. They didn't ask if he had time. They just climbed down and waited, eyes on the tarp like it might move on its own. Tommy wiped his hands on a rag that had once been white and stepped out from under the roll-up door that squealed every morning like an old dog complaining about life. The air smelled like oil and warm rubber and dust. It was Tuesday. It was always Tuesday in this town. Same traffic, same people, same problems, until something like this showed up and bent Tom a little. The tallest one, gray beard, a scar slicing through his left eyebrow, gripped the edge of the canvas and looked at Tommy as if asking permission without speaking. Tommy didn't nod. He didn't need to. Whatever was under that tarp had already claimed the room the moment it arrived. The other two men took the opposite corners. They pulled in one smooth motion. The bike appeared like a relic dragged up from a riverbed, chrome dulled and pitted, paint peeled into curling flakes, rust biting deep into the tank like it had grown there. The tires were flattened and rotted, the exhaust pipes so caked with grime they looked sealed shut. For a second, the garage went quieter than it should have been, even with the fluorescent lights humming and the distant whisper of trucks rolling by on the highway. Tommy's chest tightened in a way he didn't like. He stepped closer, slow, boots scraping concrete, eyes tracking lines he recognized the way you recognize a face you haven't seen in decades and wish you hadn't. His jaw worked as if chewing on words he didn't want to swallow. "I know this machine," he said finally, voice low. The tall man's gaze didn't soften, but something passed between them. Confirmation, maybe, or relief that the burden had landed on the right shoulders. "Then you know what we're asking," the man said, voice like gravel dragged across stone. Tommy lifted a hand to the back of his neck, rubbed the spot where old aches lived, and stared at the bike like it was a ghost in steel. "Yeah," he said, and the word came out tired. "I know." He didn't look up when he added, "And I know it's impossible." The tall man didn't argue. He didn't need to. Men like that don't waste breath trying to convince you. They let the weight of what they want do the talking. "We promised him," one of the others said, quieter, like he didn't like saying it out loud. "We're running out of people who'll even touch it." Tommy's fingers hovered over the frame, stopped short of contact, and for an instant he was back on a desert highway in Arizona years ago, grit in his teeth, sun hammering the world flat, a man stepping out of nowhere when Tommy needed him most. A man with a look in his eyes like he'd already seen the ending and decided to change it. Ghost. That nickname didn't fit because he was quiet. It fit because he appeared at the exact moment trouble hit, like a shadow moving ahead of disaster. Tommy forced his mind back to the garage. "Roll it inside," he said, because the alternative was telling them no, and for reasons he couldn't explain without sounding like an idiot, no wasn't an option. They wheeled it down, the tires protesting, the old suspension sagging like tired shoulders. Inside, under the hard white lights, the bike looked worse. It had that particular look machines get when they've been left alone too long, like they've stopped being objects and become stories nobody finished telling. Tommy didn't let himself touch it yet. He circled once, then again, scanning for the obvious killers, cracks in the frame, warps in the forks, missing pieces that would turn hard into done. He found plenty to fear. Rust had claimed edges. Rubber had given up. A film of neglect coated everything. But beneath the grime, the bones still held a shape that felt stubborn. Tommy's eyes flicked to the men. "You want honesty," he said. "You're going to get it. This isn't a tune-up. This is a resurrection." The tall man nodded once. "We're not asking for pretty," he said. "We're asking for running." Tommy almost laughed, because those were two different worlds, and both of them knew it. He didn't laugh. He glanced toward the office, where the phone sat like a promise he'd made to the town that he'd always answer. He thought about the last time he'd seen Ghost, not in a hospital bed, not in some memory colored by regret, but in motion, hair whipping in the wind, That black tank with the silver flames catching light. The sound of that engine you could feel before you heard. "Give me 3 days," Tommy said. The scarred man's expression didn't change. "You can have 3, he said. "But understand, this isn't about you." Tommy's mouth tightened. "I know," he said. "It's about him." When the bikers stepped back, the garage felt bigger and smaller at the same time. Tommy called in favors the way men his age do, without apology, without fluff, because years of living has taught you that pride is expensive. Ray Booker showed up first, senior mechanic. 20 years rebuilding police Harleys and anything else with a badge attached to it. Ray's hands were the hands of a man who trusted manuals, torque specs, and process. He walked around the bike with a flashlight, making small sounds in his throat that translated to, "You've got to be kidding me." Linda Kaczynski arrived next, engine specialist, sharp tongue, sharper eyes, the kind of mechanic who could smell a problem before the hood even lifted. She didn't greet the bikers. She barely greeted Tommy. She just crouched by the engine, pulled a plug, held it up under the light, and let out a short laugh that wasn't amused. "This thing's a museum exhibit," she said. "Not a project." Ray started with the fuel system. He pulled the tank, traced the lines, disconnected the carb. What came out wasn't fuel. It was something closer to fossil, hard, clogged, like time itself had poured concrete into the veins. He held the line up and looked at Tommy. "This isn't a bike anymore," Ray said. "It's a coffin on wheels." Linda moved to wiring. She traced connections with her fingers, and the insulation crumbled like dead leaves. Copper beneath had turned green, corroded, broken in places. She checked the battery, swollen, leaked, useless. She tugged gently at cables, some frayed in her hands. Brake lines were cracked. Rubber was dry-rotted. She didn't need hours to see the pattern. "Even if we replaced everything," she said, standing up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "And I mean everything. The frame's compromised. You put this on the road, she'll tear herself apart at 60. Tommy didn't argue. He'd spent the first night alone with the bike, running his hand over welds, hunting for hairline fractures like a man searching for a reason to hope. He found stress lines that made his stomach sink. The kind of tiny breaks that don't look like much until they're the reason you're sliding down asphalt. Still, he made them keep going, because he needed certainty. By day 3, the garage looked like a morgue. Parts laid out on tarps, tagged, cataloged, the floor littered with the evidence of time. Corroded plugs, cracked hoses, wires that snapped when you bent them. Ray had filled pages of notes. Linda had photos, measurements, a list of what would have to be replaced just to make it safe enough to roll down a driveway. They stood around the workbench in silence, and it wasn't the comfortable kind. Ray spoke first. "I've rebuilt bikes that spent 6 months underwater," he said. "I've rebuilt bikes that caught fire. This is beyond salvage. Fuel system's gone. Electrical's gone. Frame's not trustworthy. You'd have to rebuild 90% of it, and you still wouldn't have the original machine. You'd have a replica with a story attached." Linda nodded, not triumphant, just tired. "It's not money," she said. "It's physics. Metal fatigues. Rubber rots. Sitting kills machines faster than riding them." Tommy stared at the bike's bare frame like it might answer him. The bikers watched from near the door, saying little, faces hard in that way men get when they've already grieved but still have to do the final act. Ray put a hand on Tommy's shoulder, gentler than he looked. "I know what this meant to Ghost," he said. "I know what you're trying to do. But some things can't be brought back." Tommy didn't answer, because the truth was he'd been thinking the same thing, and hearing it out loud felt like failing twice. The garage hummed with fluorescent light. Outside, traffic on Route 49 kept pretending the world was normal. That's when the door opened and a kid walked in like he belonged there, even though he wasn't supposed to. Jesse Carter was 18, tall and lean, with grease stained permanently under his fingernails, the kind of stain that doesn't wash out because it becomes part of you. He carried a toolbox that looked older than he was, worn leather handle, corners scuffed, the weight of it held with a quiet familiarity. He didn't look at Ray. He didn't look at Linda. He didn't even look at the Hells Angels. His eyes went straight to the bike, and the way he moved toward it wasn't cocky. It was focused, almost careful, like approaching an animal that had been hurt. Tommy wiped his hands and stepped forward. "Can I help you, son?" Jesse didn't answer right away. He set the toolbox down with both hands like it mattered, then reached out and put his palm on the frame, fingers spread wide. He closed his eyes for half a second, the way someone does when they're checking if a door is locked or a stove is off. Except it was like he was checking for a pulse. Ray straightened, irritation flickering. "We're working here," he said. "This isn't a museum." Jesse didn't look at him. He ran his hand along the metal, slow, tracing welds, feeling for cracks. Linda watched with her arms crossed, already preparing the speech she'd give later about teenagers and confidence. Jesse crouched, studied the lower frame, then stood and looked at Tommy. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You're giving up on her," he said. Linda let out a short, sharp laugh. "Giving up?" she said. "There's nothing to give up on. That bike is done." Jesse's hand stayed on the frame. "Done isn't a diagnosis," he said. Not rude, not challenging, just stating a fact like he'd learned it the hard way. He turned fully toward Tommy then, and his eyes were steady in a way that made Tommy's throat tighten, because it reminded him of someone else, someone who used to stand like that, shoulders back, refusing to accept what the world declared final. "I'll make it run again," Jesse said. 3 words that landed in the room like a dropped wrench. Loud, unavoidable, instantly changing the air. Ray's mouth opened, then closed. Linda stared at the kid like he'd announced he could reverse gravity. The Hells Angels didn't move, but Tommy saw the smallest shift in their posture. The first flicker of interest, like a door cracking open in a wall they'd built to protect themselves from disappointment. Tommy should have laughed. He should have sent Jesse home. He should have explained the notes, the dead wiring, the fossilized fuel, the compromised frame. He should have been the adult, the professional, the realistic one. Instead, he found himself studying Jesse's face, seeing determination that didn't look like performance. It looked like history. Like a kid who'd fixed a lawnmower for a neighbor for free, not because he wanted praise, but because he couldn't stand the idea of something being discarded when it still had life in it. Tommy felt the old ache in his back and the older ache in his chest, the one that showed up when he remembered Ghost. He heard Ray in his head saying physics doesn't care about hope. He heard the scarred man saying we promised him. And then he heard Jesse's voice again, not loud, not dramatic, just human. "Give me a chance," Jesse said to Tommy, and for the first time he looked around at the others like he saw them as people and not obstacles. 5 days, Tommy said before he could stop himself, and the number came out like a gamble he was placing with his own hands. Ray snapped his head toward him. "Tommy," Linda's eyebrows shot up. The Hells Angels stayed still, but their eyes sharpened. Jesse didn't smile. He just nodded once, like he'd expected nothing less. "You work alone unless you ask for help," Tommy continued, because if he was going to do something reckless, he was going to put rails on it. "You don't leave this garage until you're done, or you tell me you can't. And if you damage anything, you're out." Ray scoffed under his breath. "When he fails," Ray said, voice hard, "we're done with this circus and we do what we should have done on day 1. Jesse finally looked at Ray then, and there was no arrogance in his eyes. Just calm. "Fair," Jesse said. Tommy reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys to the garage, the keys he'd never handed to anyone who didn't have decades in this place, and tossed them. Jesse caught them without looking, like his hands had already learned how to hold responsibility. The metal of the keys jingled once and went quiet. Tommy felt his own heartbeat answer that sound. The clock had started, even if nobody said it out loud, and the next 5 days were going to decide more than whether an engine could turn over. Jesse didn't celebrate the keys in his pocket like they were some trophy. He treated them like a responsibility that could cut him if he got careless, and the first thing he did after everyone drifted out wasn't to grab a wrench, wasn't to start tearing into the engine the way the crowd would expect, but to roll the bike into the best light under the fluorescence and just stand there with his hands at his sides, breathing slow until his heartbeat stopped racing. The garage sounded different when it was empty. No voices, no boots, no laughter, just the quiet ticking of cooling metal from other jobs and the soft hum of the lights. And Jesse wanted that quiet because machines told the truth in quiet. He turned off the radio someone had left on in the corner. Then he walked around the bike in a slow circle, eyes moving like he was reading a page, not looking for the dramatic failures Ray and Linda had already cataloged, but for the small things that didn't fit. He touched the tank, not romantic, not theatrical, just enough to feel how deep the rust was and where it stopped being surface and started being hunger. He followed the line of the frame with 2 fingers, pausing at welds, feeling for a ridge that shouldn't be there. He leaned close to the engine block and inhaled near the fins. There was an old oil smell buried under dust, and beneath that, something faintly sweet from fuel that hadn't been fuel in a long time. He crouched and looked under the bike with a flashlight, and that's where the first real difference showed itself. A fuel line that wasn't original. Not in a way that would jump out to a mechanic moving fast, but in a way you'd notice if you'd grown up fixing lawnmowers and generators for neighbors who didn't have money for proper parts. The kind of jobs where you learn to spot improvisation because you've done it yourself. The hose color was wrong. The routing wasn't clean. The clamps didn't match, and one section had a bend that looked forced, like somebody had made do with whatever was on hand. Jesse traced it from tank to carb and found a splice, then another, each with different material, different age, different kind of clamp, like a timeline of desperate roadside fixes. He sat back on his heels and stared at that line until his eyes stopped seeing rubber and started seeing what it meant. Somebody had fought to keep this bike alive after it was supposed to be done. If it had been mothballed right after 1988, there wouldn't be patchwork like that. The bike would have been frozen in its damage, not modified with mismatched hose. This wasn't proof it ran last week, but it was proof it hadn't been a perfect, untouchable shrine all those years. It had been handled, worked on, possibly even started, and that mattered because it changed the conversation from resurrection to wake up. Jesse didn't say that out loud because nobody was there to hear it, and because saying it too early would tempt fate. He opened his toolbox and laid out what he needed with deliberate order: rag, small picks, a few wrenches, a notebook, and he wrote one sentence on the first page in block letters: find what survived. Then he started where the others had started, but with a different mindset. Not replace, but recover. He drained what he could from the tank, and what came out was thick, dark, and sour, the kind of fluid that used to be gasoline, but had spent years becoming something else. He didn't gag, didn't flinch. He'd smelled worse in barns and backyards. He pulled the carburetor and set it on a clean cloth like it was delicate. Then he disassembled it piece by piece, placing each jet, each screw, each gasket in a line so he could put it back together without guessing. Where Ray would have thrown up his hands and ordered a rebuild kit and a new carb, Jesse cleaned channels with a thin wire, held parts up to the light, used a magnifier, and kept going until he could see daylight through passages that had been sealed by time. He soaked components, scrubbed them, let them dry, then checked again, because he knew the difference between seems clear and is clear could be the difference between a cough and a fire. Hours passed without him noticing. He moved to the fuel line itself, pulled sections carefully, heated hardened deposits just enough to soften, flushed, scraped, flushed again, and for the pieces that were too far gone he didn't pretend he could save them. He measured them, wrote down the lengths, the angles, the diameter, and then he walked out back to the yard behind the garage where Tommy kept broken machines for parts and spent an hour digging like a raccoon with purpose. He came back with a length of hose from an old Sportster, a filter that looked like it had been forgotten in a coffee can, and connectors that didn't match anything factory but matched each other enough to hold. When the sky outside the high windows shifted from late afternoon to deep blue, Jesse was still there, hands blackened, shoulders stiff, but his mind calm. He reassembled the carb and held it like he could feel whether it was ready. He didn't trust feeling alone, so he tested, blew air through passages, checked seals. Then he set the rebuilt system beside the bike and didn't install it yet. Instead, he sat down on the concrete, back against a workbench, and closed his eyes for a minute, not sleeping, just letting his brain reset the way his grandfather had taught him. Slow down, because rushing makes you break things you can't replace. When he opened his eyes, he looked at the bike again and made himself do something that would look crazy to anybody watching. He listened. Not mystical, just practical. He pressed his ear near the engine and stayed there long enough to hear the tiny noises most people never notice. The faint creak of cooling metal, the distant vibration from trucks passing outside, the way the garage itself settled as the temperature dropped. Machines had patterns. They also had tells. Jesse didn't hear any miracle. What he heard was the absence of catastrophic damage. No sharp clink from loose shards in the crankcase. No rattle that suggested broken internals banging around. It wasn't proof of health, but it was enough to keep him moving. He locked up around midnight, stepped out into the cool air, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he let himself smile. Small, private, and quickly gone, because now he had a path. By the time dawn spilled gray light across Route 49, the garage door was already up and Jesse was already working, and the town, being the kind of town that feeds on unusual things the way dry ground drinks rain, started showing up. At first it was one pickup that slowed and parked. Then two bikes rolled in and shut off their engines like they didn't want to disturb something sacred. A couple men wandered to the entrance with coffee cups and skeptical faces, and once the first group was there, more came, because people are like that. They don't want to miss the moment when someone else finds out whether they were right to doubt. By mid-morning, the garage had that crowd feel. The low murmur of conversation, the shifting boots, the way everyone tries to stand like they belong even when they're just there to watch. Jesse didn't look up much, but he heard them, because you can't not hear a room full of people talking about you like your entertainment. Kid's gonna snap a bolt and cry, someone said. $20, he quits by tomorrow, another replied. A man with a stained cap started a betting pool on a crate like it was a sporting event. I give him until lunch, someone laughed. Jesse kept his eyes on the work. He'd mounted the tank loosely and was fitting the rebuilt fuel lines with the care of someone tying a knot that had to hold in a storm. Linda came by late morning, not because she believed, but because curiosity is a stronger force than pride. She stayed near the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, gaze sharp, watching Jesse's hands. Ray arrived too, leaning against a wall like he didn't care, but he cared. Tommy drifted between the office and the shop floor, listening without speaking, and every now and then he'd catch a phrase from the crowd that made his face harden, because he'd seen this town eat young men alive when they failed in public. Jesse didn't talk back. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even do the thing most people do when they're nervous, which is make jokes. He worked. He installed the fuel system piece by piece, tightening clamps evenly, checking alignment, making sure nothing rubbed where vibration could chew through it later. Then, instead of trying to start the bike like everyone wanted, he pressurized the system with a hand pump, slowly, watching for leaks the way a man watches a newborn breathe. He wiped each connection and checked again. The crowd got impatient. Started already, someone called. Jesse didn't answer. He continued testing until he was satisfied that if fuel flowed, it would flow where it should and not onto a hot surface. Only then did he open the flow and watch the line fill, and when it held without sweating a drop, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't victory. It was the first step toward a possibility. He looked up for the first time in hours and met Tommy's eyes. He didn't grin. He just gave a small nod that said, "One system down." Tommy nodded back, and Linda, watching from her spot, felt something shift in her skepticism because that was not the work of a kid playing hero. That was the work of someone who'd learned patience the hard way. Ray, however, couldn't help himself. He stepped closer, eyes on the bike, then on Jesse. "Fuel line holding pressure doesn't mean she'll run," he said. "It means you built a pipe." Jesse glanced at him calmly. "It means she can breathe," he said, and went back to work. The crowd laughed, but it wasn't all mocking now. Some of it had that edge of surprise, because Jesse didn't sound like a kid performing confidence. He sounded like someone who believed what he said. As the day slid into afternoon, Jesse moved to the electrical system, and the mood shifted again because even the non-mechanics could sense this was where the story got ugly. Fuel is dirty, sure, but wires are cruel. One bad connection and you chase ghosts for days. Jesse pulled the harness gently, and it didn't just look old. It came apart in his fingers the way burnt paper crumbles. He traced the main power line from where the battery should sit to the ignition, and sections of insulation fell away like dandruff. Copper beneath was green and brittle. A connector housing cracked when he touched it. He stopped and just stared for a long moment, because this was the point where a lot of people quit, not because it's impossible, but because it's exhausting in a way that feels personal. The crowd sensed it. Someone whistled low. "There it is," a man said. "Game over." Ray straightened like he'd been waiting for this proof. "Those connectors aren't made anymore," he said, loud enough for Jesse to hear and loud enough for the crowd to catch. "Haven't been in decades." He said it like an ending. Jesse didn't argue. He didn't puff up. He just reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn soft, and unrolled it on the workbench. Inside were salvaged electrical pieces, pins, terminals, small housings, taken from old radios, dead televisions, appliances people had thrown away. Linda's eyes narrowed, because she recognized that kit. It was the kind of kit you build when you've spent years fixing what others scrap. Jessie held up a connector, studied the pins, then looked at the broken harness and made a decision that didn't feel like bravado. It felt like the only option left. "Then I'll make them," he said, quietly, and for a moment the garage didn't laugh. The crowd murmured instead, the way people do when they're not sure whether they're witnessing stupidity or something rare. Tommy watched Jessie's face, saw strain there now, not fear, but the weight of the next climb. Linda stepped closer, voice low so it didn't become a show. "You sure you know what you're doing?" she asked. Jesse's hands didn't shake as he sorted the components. "I know what I can test," he said. "I know what I can prove." And then he started stripping wire, cleaning ends, building one connection at a time with a soldering iron he'd brought, because he'd expected this. He'd shrinking seals like he was wrapping wounds. Hours later, the sun was low and the crowd had thinned from boredom and hunger. But the ones who remained were quieter now, watching more intently, because there's something hypnotic about someone working with absolute focus while everyone else talks. Jesse tested continuity with a multimeter, checked resistance, redid any connection that didn't read clean, and as he worked he kept glancing back at the bike like it was listening too. The first time he heard the faint click deep inside the engine, he froze with the soldering iron in his hand, heart stuttering for a second, and he pressed his palm against the frame to feel if it was imagination. The click came again, subtle, rhythmic, like metal settling, and Jesse didn't smile or announce anything. He just stored it away in his mind as a note the machine had handed him. When Tommy finally told the last spectators to go home and lock the door behind them, Jesse was still there at the bench, eyes gritty, hands aching, wiring laid out like veins waiting to be stitched. Day 2 hadn't ended with an engine roar or even a cough. It ended with a different kind of tension, the kind that comes when the easy wins are gone and the real fight begins, because Jesse had proven one thing to everyone who mattered. He wasn't playing. And he'd also uncovered the truth that was going to test him harder than any joke from the crowd ever could. The bike's heart might still be intact, but its nerves were shredded, and bringing it back would require him to rebuild a language no manual could teach. By the morning of day 3, the garage didn't feel like Tommy's anymore. It felt like a place holding its breath. The early crowd had learned something on day 2. This wasn't a circus trick, and it wasn't ending in 5 minutes. So they arrived quieter, coffee cups in hand, boots scuffing concrete without the same sharp edge of mockery. Jesse was already there, hunched over the workbench with the wiring harness spread out like a patient on an operating table, a desk lamp angled low, soldering iron hot, small curls of smoke lifting and disappearing into the fluorescent haze. He hadn't gone home until after midnight, and even then sleep had come in short, restless pieces, his brain replaying the faint click he'd heard deep in the engine block, the subtle rhythm that didn't sound like destruction but didn't sound harmless either. He kept that thought tucked away, because today wasn't about opening the engine yet. Today was about making sure that if it tried to speak, the bike would have a way to send the signal. Ray walked in, hands in his jacket pockets, expression guarded. He didn't say good morning. He just watched Jesse twist 2 wires together with careful precision, tin the ends, slide heat shrink tubing into place, and seal it with a steadiness that didn't look 18. Linda came in behind him, hair tied back, eyes sharp. She'd brought her own multimeter, and that small detail didn't go unnoticed by Tommy, who leaned in the office doorway pretending to check paperwork while he watched everything. Jesse finished a connection and immediately tested continuity, eyes flicking to the screen, not trusting a good-looking joint until the numbers said it was real. He moved methodically, rebuilding sections of harness with salvaged pins that he'd reshaped the night before, carving tiny adjustments with a file until they fit the housing snugly enough to hold. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't factory, but it was deliberate. The crowd thinned and thickened in waves, some people drifting in to see if the kid had burned the place down yet, others staying longer than they meant to because there's something hard to walk away from when someone is fighting time without dramatics. Around noon, one of the connectors Jesse had built failed its first test. The resistance reading was too high, and instead of cursing or hiding it, he cut it out clean and started over. Ray saw that and frowned, not because he enjoyed the mistake, but because the correction was the move of someone who knew pride was more dangerous than error. "You're rebuilding a nervous system," Ray said finally, voice neutral. Even if you get spark, timing could be shot. Compression could be gone. Jesse didn't look up. One problem at a time, he said. If she can't talk, I won't know what she's saying. It wasn't clever. It was honest. And for the first time, Ray didn't have an immediate comeback. By mid-afternoon, the main power line ran clean from battery position to ignition. Jesse had sourced a temporary battery from a shelf of trade-ins, cleaned its terminals, and mounted it with a makeshift brace that looked ugly but solid. He checked grounds twice, sanded a contact point until bare metal shone, then bolted it tight. Linda crouched beside him, watching the way he traced the system with his finger before applying power. "You always work like this?" she asked quietly. Jesse shrugged slightly. "If I rush, I miss things," he said. "Missing things costs more later." There was no performance in his tone. It sounded like something learned from experience that didn't come from textbooks. When he finally connected the battery and flipped the ignition switch, nothing dramatic happened. No sparks, no smoke. Just a faint readiness in the bike, like a body that had remembered it once had nerves. Jesse pressed the starter lightly, without fully committing, just enough to test the circuit. The click he heard wasn't the dull emptiness of a dead machine. It was sharper now, accompanied by a slight twitch deep in the block. The crowd, sensing movement, edged closer. Ray crossed his arms tighter. "Don't flood it," he muttered, as if the kid didn't know. Jesse didn't try to start it fully yet. Instead, he leaned close again, ear near the engine, listening for that click he'd noticed the night before. It came back, faint but patterned. Click, click, pause, click. Not random, not violent, just off. He pulled back, mind racing, but he forced himself not to jump ahead. Fuel and spark first. He removed a plug, grounded it against the frame, and hit the starter briefly. A thin blue spark snapped across the gap. Not strong yet, but alive. A murmur rippled through the garage. Linda leaned in closer despite herself. "Again," she said. He did. The spark held, steadier. Jesse replaced the plug, tightened it with measured care, and wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days. The air in the garage felt different now, not hopeful exactly, but charged. Tommy stepped forward, eyes on Jesse. "You close?" he asked. Jesse exhaled slowly. "Close enough to try," he said, and even as he said it, his stomach tightened. Because trying meant the first public verdict. He rolled the bike upright, checked the fuel flow once more, opened the valve, and let the carb fill. The crowd pressed in tighter, forming a semicircle that felt more like a courtroom than a garage. Derek Voss hadn't appeared yet, but the absence didn't make the moment lighter. Ray stepped back a half pace. Linda stayed where she was, arms folded, but eyes bright with something she hadn't expected to feel. Jesse swung a leg over the bike, but didn't sit fully. He kept one foot planted, grounding himself. He turned the key. The click came again, louder now with the electrical fully alive. He hit the starter. The engine coughed once, sharp, sudden, like an old man clearing his throat after years of silence. The crowd inhaled collectively. Jesse didn't grin. He adjusted the choke slightly and tried again. The engine sputtered, pistons moving, metal grinding against old hesitation. A second cough, deeper this time. Then it died back into clicking. A few people laughed nervously. Someone muttered, "Told you." Jesse felt heat rise up his neck, but he kept his face neutral. He tried again, adjusting fuel flow by instinct, listening to the rhythm between attempts. Third try, a longer sputter, a brief, rough rumble that vibrated the frame under his hands, then silence. This time, nobody laughed. The garage had shifted from entertainment to suspense. Ray stepped forward slowly and put a hand on the seat, not to stop Jesse, but to steady the moment. "You're close," Ray admitted, the words tasting unfamiliar. "But something's fighting you." Jesse nodded once. "I know," he said. He killed the ignition and dismounted, heart pounding not from failure, but from confirmation. It wanted to run. The click pattern replayed in his head, precise, nagging. He crouched beside the engine, pressing his ear close again despite the heat. Click, click, pause. It wasn't chaotic. It was misaligned. He stood up slowly, mind narrowing on that sound. Linda watched his expression change. "What is it?" she asked. Jesse hesitated. "It's not random," he said. "It's like something's just off, not broken." Ray shook his head. "Off is broken when you're talking valves and timing," he said. Jesse looked at him calmly. "Or it's just not where it's supposed to be." The distinction hung there, subtle but enormous. Tommy stepped closer, reading the tension in Jesse's shoulders. "You got something?" he asked. Jesse wiped his hands again, smearing grease across his cheek without noticing. "Maybe," he said. "But if I'm right, I need quiet." The crowd didn't love that. They wanted noise, fireworks, a quick ending. But Tommy raised a hand, and surprisingly, the murmurs died down. Jesse removed the starter cover, checked alignment markers, turned the engine manually with careful pressure, feeling resistance points. Each turn brought that faint internal click, and the pattern grew clearer. He felt it through the wrench more than he heard it. Something in the valve train wasn't moving cleanly. He didn't open it yet, not fully, not in front of everyone. Instead, he stepped back and looked at the bike as if it were a person who'd tried to speak and gotten stuck on a word. The crowd began to thin again as the afternoon wore on. People had jobs, dinners, lives. But those who stayed sensed the shift. This wasn't about spark anymore. It was about the heart of the machine. By sunset, Jesse's hands were shaking slightly from fatigue, and he forced himself to stop before exhaustion turned focus into recklessness. He shut everything down carefully, disconnected the battery, and covered the bike lightly, not hiding it, just protecting it from dust overnight. Ray approached him at the door. "You pushed it hard today," Ray said, voice quieter than before. Most kids would have forced it until something snapped. Jesse met his eyes, tired but steady. "If I force it," he said, "I prove them right." Ray didn't ask who them was. He didn't need to. Linda lingered near the workbench, staring at the half-rebuilt harness with a kind of reluctant admiration. "You're not wrong about one thing," she said as Jesse grabbed his jacket. "She's not dead." It was the closest thing to endorsement he'd get from her. Tommy walked Jesse to the door. The sky outside was turning that deep purple that makes Route 49 look almost peaceful. "Tomorrow's day 4, Tommy said quietly. "You sure you want the crowd back?" Jesse looked back into the dim garage where the bike waited, half awake. "They can come," he said. "I just need to hear her." Tommy studied him for a long second, then nodded. "Get some sleep," he said. Jesse smiled faintly. "I will," he lied. As he walked down the road toward his place, the click echoed in his mind, steady and insistent, not the sound of a machine giving up, but the sound of something misaligned by time and waiting for the smallest correction. And somewhere under the exhaustion and pressure, Jesse felt the shape of the problem forming. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, just precise. Day 3 hadn't ended in triumph, but it had done something more dangerous. It had proven the bike wanted to come back. And now the question wasn't whether it could run. The question was whether Jesse could find the one thing standing in its way before the whole town decided he'd run out of time. Day 4 started louder than the others, like the town had collectively decided this was the day something would finally break. Trucks lined Route 49 before the sun had fully climbed, engines ticking as they cooled, men leaning against hoods with arms crossed, women standing in small clusters whispering like they were waiting outside a hospital room. Word had traveled beyond town limits now. 2 bikes with out-of-state plates rolled in before 8, their riders stepping off slowly, eyes scanning the garage as if measuring the weight of what was happening inside. Jesse had barely slept. He'd laid in bed staring at the ceiling while the faint mechanical rhythm replayed in his head. Click, click, pause. Not violent, not random, just wrong by a fraction. By the time he reached the garage that morning, the fatigue had settled deep into his bones. But beneath it was something sharper, clarity. Tommy was already there, coffee untouched on the desk, watching the street through the office window. "They're multiplying," he muttered when Jesse walked in. Jesse glanced over his shoulder at the growing crowd and felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old reflex that had followed him since he was 7 years old, the feeling of being watched and weighed. He swallowed it down. This wasn't about him, he reminded himself. It couldn't be. The bike sat where he'd left it, half-covered, wires rebuilt, fuel lines sealed, waiting. He uncovered it slowly, almost respectfully, as if the act itself required steadiness. Ray arrived next, face unreadable, though the set of his jaw suggested he'd prepared himself for disappointment. Linda came in behind him and didn't speak at all, just moved to her stool near the wall, hands folded loosely in her lap, like she was attending something solemn. The Hells Angels stood near the entrance, silent as always, their presence heavier than the crowd's noise. Jesse rolled the bike upright and began the checks he'd memorized. Fuel flow steady, electrical connections tight, grounds clean, spark consistent. Each step felt smaller than the noise around him. The crowd's murmurs rose and fell like waves. Someone had started filming on their phone. Jesse blocked it out as best he could. He swung a leg over the bike, and this time sat fully, hands on the grips, feeling the worn leather of the seat beneath him. He closed his eyes for one slow breath. "All right," he murmured under his breath, not to the crowd, not even to Tommy, just to the machine. He turned the key. The familiar click answered, sharper now in the morning air. He hit the starter. The engine coughed immediately, a rough bark that rippled through the garage. The crowd jolted. He adjusted the choke and tried again. The pistons moved, struggling but determined, the sound louder than the day before. A sputter turned into a short, uneven rumble. Hope flared in the room like someone had struck a match. Jesse twisted the throttle slightly, coaxing. For 3 seconds the engine vibrated under him, alive in a way that made his heart slam against his ribs, and then it died. The clicking returned, hollow and relentless. A collective exhale swept through the crowd, heavier this time. Jesse didn't move. He tried again. Cough. Sputter. Click. Again. Weaker. Again. Nothing but the mechanical snap of resistance. Ray stepped forward slowly and rested a hand on Jesse's shoulder. "That's compression," Ray said quietly, not unkind. "Something deep." Jesse stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He tried one last time. The engine didn't even cough. Just click. Silence. The kind that lands like a verdict. Someone near the back let out a soft laugh that tried to hide relief. "Told you," a voice muttered. Jesse swung off the bike slowly, legs unsteady. For a moment, he just stood there looking at the machine that had almost answered him. The room blurred at the edges. Tommy stepped forward. "You got closer than anyone thought," he said, voice steady but careful. Jesse's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Closed doesn't count," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that surprised him. He turned away before anyone could see his face fully, walked to the far wall, and slid down until he was sitting on the concrete with his head bowed. The noise in the garage faded to a distant hum. All he could hear was the echo of that word from years ago. Worthless. Not enough. Not worth the trouble. He'd fixed so many things since then, small engines, radios, broken tools, each repair like a quiet argument against the sentence his father had left behind. This bike had felt different. Bigger. If he could bring it back, it would mean something beyond spark and fuel. It would mean he wasn't broken either. Ray crouched nearby, but didn't speak. Linda stood frozen, hands pressed lightly to her mouth. Tommy walked over and lowered himself beside Jesse with the slow effort of a man who'd worked too many years on hard floors. For a long moment, he said nothing. The crowd had quieted, sensing this wasn't entertainment anymore. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Tommy asked softly. Jesse didn't look up. His voice came rough and low. "My dad left when I was 7, he said. He told my mom I wasn't worth the trouble." The words hung there, raw and unpolished. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Jesse swallowed hard. "Everything I've ever fixed, it was me trying to prove him wrong. That abandoned doesn't mean worthless. That something people give up on still has value." He finally looked up, eyes bright with frustration that wasn't about mechanics. "I thought if I could fix this, if I could make something everyone said was dead run again, it would mean I was right." Tommy felt his chest tighten because he recognized that kind of fight. "This bike doesn't decide that," Tommy said quietly. "It never did." Jesse shook his head, tears cutting through grease on his cheeks. "It feels like it does." Tommy put a hand on the floor between them, not touching, just anchoring himself. "Listen to me," he said. "You worked 4 days straight. You got closer than 5 experts. That's not failure. That's proof." Jesse stared at the bike again, silent. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations hushed. Ray squeezed Jesse's shoulder once before standing. Linda gave him a look that held respect now, not doubt. By late afternoon, the garage had emptied until only the core remained. Tommy stood in the doorway as the sun dipped low. "Get some sleep," he said gently. "We'll figure out what to tell them." Jesse nodded but didn't move. When the door finally closed and the lock clicked, the garage felt cavernous. The bike stood in the dim light like it had before, quiet, stubborn. Jesse stayed on the floor for a long time, staring at nothing. Eventually he stood, wiped his face with his sleeve, and walked back to the machine. Midnight crept in unnoticed. He flipped on a single work light and let the rest of the garage remain in shadow. He placed his hand on the engine block again and leaned close. Silence at first. Then there it was. Click, click, pause. Softer without the crowd. Clearer without the pressure. He held his breath and listened. It wasn't the sound of something shattered. It was the sound of resistance misaligned. He grabbed a wrench and removed the valve cover carefully. Bolts laid out in order, light angled just right. Oil residue glistened faintly. He turned the engine by hand, slow and steady. The rocker arms moved, but one shifted a fraction differently, just enough to catch, just enough to throw timing off by a hair. Not broken, not seized, just off. Jesse's heartbeat steadied. He stared at it, disbelief mixing with relief. All the noise, all the doubt, all the weight, and the problem was smaller than anyone had looked for. He let out a breath that felt like he'd been holding it for years. "You're not dead," he whispered to the engine. "You're just out of place." He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a worn valve adjustment wrench his grandfather had given him when he was 13. The handle was smooth from use, familiar in his palm. He loosened the lock nut gently, adjusted the rocker arm by millimeters, feeling for the precise resistance that told him it was seated correctly. He checked clearance with a feeler gauge. Perfect. He moved to the next cylinder, found the same subtle shift, corrected it. By the time he replaced the cover and tightened the bolts in proper sequence, the clock read nearly 2 in the morning. The garage was silent except for his breathing. He stood back and looked at the bike, exhaustion replaced by something steadier. Not triumph. Not yet. Just certainty. Day 4 hadn't ended in failure after all. It had ended in understanding. And when Jesse finally locked the garage and stepped into the cool night air, he knew one thing with clarity that cut through every doubt. The bike didn't need to be rebuilt. It needed to be realigned. And so did he. Day 5 felt different before Jesse even reached the garage. The air on Route 49 carried that restless tension small towns get when something unusual is about to happen, like a storm building over flat land. He'd slept 3 hours at most, but the exhaustion no longer dragged at him the same way. The panic was gone. In its place was a quiet steadiness that came from knowing exactly what the problem was. Not catastrophic damage. Not a dead engine. Just something shifted out of place. By the time he turned the corner, the street was already lined with motorcycles. Chrome caught the early light. Engines ticked as they cooled. Voices stayed low, not mocking now, not joking. Waiting. When Jesse stepped into Tommy's garage, conversations thinned into silence the way sound does in a church. The bike stood under the lights like it always had, but now Jesse looked at it without desperation. Tommy met him halfway across the floor. "You good?" he asked. Jesse nodded once. "She is," he said. Ray stood near the back wall, arms crossed, but not defensive anymore. Linda leaned against her stool, eyes locked on Jesse with something that looked like anticipation instead of doubt. The 3 Hells Angels who had brought the bike in were already there, their presence steady, watchful. Jesse didn't rush. He removed the valve cover again, not for show, not to explain. He checked each rocker arm, each clearance, fingers moving with certainty. Everything sat exactly where it should now. He resealed the cover, tightened bolts in order, wiped excess oil, and stepped back. The crowd leaned in as one body. At 9 sharp, a black Mercedes rolled slowly into the lot, polished and out of place among pickup trucks and bikes. Derek Voss stepped out in a tailored jacket that didn't belong in a place that smelled like grease. He walked in with the confidence of a man used to buying outcomes. 15,000, he said to Tommy without greeting, voice smooth. Right now? Save everyone the disappointment. A murmur rippled through the room. Tommy didn't look away from Jesse. Not for sale, he said simply. Derek's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything's for sale, he replied. Jesse turned toward him, calm. Not this, he said. Derek glanced at the bike, then at Jesse. It's a relic, he said. Dead things look good on walls. The words hung heavy. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Jesse held Derek's gaze without anger. It belongs on the road, he said quietly. Derek gave a small laugh, as if humoring a child, and stepped back, arms folding across his chest. We'll see, he murmured. Tommy moved closer to Jesse. You don't have to do this in front of all of them, he said softly. Jesse shook his head. They came, he said. Let them see. The clock on the wall read 11. 1 hour to noon. Jesse rolled the bike forward slightly, positioning it toward the open garage door so the light from outside cut across the tank. He checked fuel flow one last time, thumbed the line gently, watched it respond. He touched the battery connection, firm. He sat down slowly on the seat. The leather creaked faintly, shaped long ago by Ghost's weight. Jesse placed both hands on the grips and felt the subtle tremor of possibility. He closed his eyes for half a breath. He wasn't thinking about his father now. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about alignment, about small things placed where they belonged. He turned the key. The first sound was that familiar click. Derek's smile twitched faintly. Ray inhaled. Jesse didn't flinch. He pressed the starter. The engine coughed, sharper than any previous attempt. A spark of sound that cut through the room. He adjusted the throttle slightly and pressed again. The pistons moved, protesting less this time. A rough rumble began, uneven but alive. The bike vibrated under him, shaking dust loose from forgotten edges. Jesse held steady, not forcing, just allowing. A third press. The rumble deepened. The vibration smoothed. And then, like something remembering its own name, the engine caught fully. The sound that filled the garage wasn't delicate. It was raw, low, and powerful, rising from deep within metal that hadn't sung in 4 decades. Exhaust burst out in a dark cloud, the smell thick and real. The engine stumbled once, then settled into a steady rhythm, rough edges smoothing as oil moved through channels that had been dry for years. For a moment, no one reacted. It was too big, too sudden. Then the sound registered in every chest. A roar erupted from the crowd. Cheers, shouts, hands slapping backs. Linda's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Ray stepped backward, shaking his head in disbelief, laughing under his breath like a man who had just been proven wrong in the best possible way. Tommy stood still, eyes bright, seeing something more than a machine run, seeing Ghost in the set of Jesse's shoulders, in the refusal to quit. The Hells Angels stepped forward together. The tall one with the scar placed a hand over his heart, nodding once. The engine continued to idle, stronger by the second. Jesse twisted the throttle gently, and the bike responded with a clean, eager growl that echoed out into Route 49. Derek Voss stood frozen near the entrance, expression hollowed of certainty. The roar of the engine seemed to push him backward without touching him. Jesse didn't rev it wildly. He let it idle, let it warm, let it remember. After a minute, the tall angel stepped up beside him and held out a folded piece of worn leather. "He'd want you to wear this," he said. Jesse reached out with trembling hands and unfolded Ghost's riding jacket. It was heavier than it looked, cracked and weathered, carrying years in its seams. He slipped it on. It fit as though it had been waiting. The leather settled over his shoulders like acceptance. Tommy moved toward the door and pulled it fully open. Sunlight flooded the concrete. "Take her out," he called over the rumble. Jesse nodded once, eased out the clutch, and rolled forward slowly. The crowd parted without being asked. Tires touched pavement beyond the garage threshold. The bike moved on to Route 49, steady and sure. Jesse shifted into second, then third, feeling the engine respond cleanly, like it had never forgotten how. The sound carried down the street, turning heads, drawing people to windows. For an hour he rode back roads, feeling the vibration steady beneath him, the rhythm consistent, strong. Linda and Ray followed in Tommy's truck at a distance, just in case. Nothing faltered. Nothing stuttered. When Jesse finally returned, the crowd was smaller but waiting. He shut off the engine gently. The sudden silence felt enormous. He sat there for a moment, hands resting on the grips, breathing hard but smiling in a way that came from deep inside. Tommy walked up slowly. "How'd she run?" he asked. Jesse looked at him, eyes bright. "Like she never stopped," he said. The Hells Angels stepped forward again, nodding in quiet gratitude. Derek lingered at the edge of the lot for a long moment, staring down the road where the bike had disappeared earlier. He looked older somehow. "I had a bike once," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Sold it when I stopped believing in things." No one responded. He got into his Mercedes and drove away without another word. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Route 49. Ray admitted openly he'd been wrong, telling anyone who'd listened that experience wasn't the same as wisdom. Linda began listening to engines a little longer before calling them dead. Tommy offered Jesse a job without ceremony. You already started, he said when Jesse asked when to begin. And the bike, Ghost's bike, didn't become a wall piece. It returned to the road where it belonged, ridden on clear mornings and quiet evenings, the engine's rumble no longer a memory but a presence. Jesse understood something then that he hadn't fully grasped before. The machine hadn't needed to be rebuilt from scratch. It needed patience. It needed someone willing to look past what was obviously broken and search for what was simply misaligned. As he stood outside the garage one evening watching the sun dip below the horizon, Route 49 glowing gold, Tommy sat beside him in easy silence. "You know what really happened in there?" Tommy asked. Jesse glanced at him. "We kept a promise," he said. Tommy nodded slowly. "That," he said. "And you proved something." Jesse didn't ask what. He didn't need to. The engine's echo still lingered in his chest, steady and alive. A reminder that sometimes the difference between dead and living is nothing more than the smallest shift back into place.